Berserk came back in the month of April 2020 with an isolated release through chapter 360, and I think I like this chapter more than most. Overall, I'd say that this chapter was a dense read with some interesting implications for the future that will inevitably lead to much speculation, some of which we'll go over in this video. Chapter 360 primarily focused on Casca and Farnese, not really learning magic, but more showing off their magical capabilities to the inhabitants of Elfhelm. We also bookended the chapter with the storyline the audience most cares about, as we briefly interact with Casca to open the chapter and briefly interact with Guts to close the chapter. But let's get into the grittier details of the chapter and talk about things step by step. As I just mentioned, the chapter opens with Casca in bed following the events of the last chapter, where for the second time she broke down trying to interact with Guts after waking up. It's explained outright in this chapter that when she thinks of Guts or sees him, she's transported back to that place, which results in a breakdown, because Casca still hasn't processed the trauma of the eclipse, as for her it only happened a few conscious days ago. Guts had to go on a rampage and nearly lose everything to even slightly retain his humanity because of the traumas of the eclipse. It's going to take a long time for Casca to even begin tackling this issue. Some people were convinced that maybe she'd permanently returned to her Elaine state following the conclusion of the last chapter, but evidently that didn't happen. Casca begins to have another panic attack here, as in explaining herself she starts to think about everything again, but before it gets too bad, Danan sedates her using the Berserk equivalent of a depressant with these pretty magical petals. Miura is demonstrating an honest way of dealing with trauma and sexual assault here, as this is a parallel to what happens in modern medicine when dealing with trauma. If someone contemporarily starts having a panic attack, they are sedated by medicine just as Casca is sedated here by these magical petals. It shows that Miura understands the process. This is deathly important because this is all part of Miura's honest effort to accurately portray trauma in his series. If Casca was just miraculously healed when she first came out of her Elaine state, that would have been far too convenient for the narrative and a terrible thematic point about the traumas of sexual assault. If an individual gets raped, Berserk would functionally be saying just to head off to the magical fairy island, where they'll cure you and we can act like this never happened. But Berserk is better than that. We will likely be seeing a long drawn out healing and recovery period for Casca, since as we said earlier, from her conscious perspective, the eclipse functionally happened a few days ago, and she hasn't even processed it yet. Thank God Miura isn't rushing through this and is taking his time. But back on that discussion about honest representations of dealing with trauma and sexual assault, Farnese's plan to create a magical medicine solution for Casca that she brings up later in the chapter must fail. Again, Miura cannot take the easy way out of this hole he's written himself into that he ignored or rather put off for 20 years. Farnese cannot just magically heal Casca's trauma with some new form of magic, because then, as I just explained, the thematic message coming across would be that sexual assault survivors shouldn't learn or relate to Casca's story, but instead seek an end-all treatment from a magical fairy kingdom, which is lazy writing. It would basically be admitting that Casca's rape wasn't actually about fleshing out her character in the future, but fleshing out Guts' character post-eclipse. So not only is this a writing cop-out, but it's also irresponsible messaging, and though Miura's track record with sexual assault and mostly the threat of sexual assault specifically with Casca hasn't been the best in the past, I still have faith that he understands the levity of this situation and will write a proper conclusion to this part of Casca's story. Trauma and getting over trauma, usually with love, is a core tenet of Berserk's writing, so hopefully we see that illustrated again here. But maybe the most interesting implication coming out of this chapter is that eventually I think we are headed for some Farnese and Casca conflict, which will make for great television. Farnese's purpose in the group so far basically boiled down to being Casca's caretaker, and now Casca can feed and bathe herself and doesn't need Farnese's absolute attention anymore. Naturally, Miura, being the fantastic author that he is, has immediately found another role for Farnese in the group with this mage stuff later in this very chapter. But the point still stands, Casca doesn't need Farnese to take care of her anymore, in the same way, and they functionally barely know each other. And the dialing up of their subconscious emotional connection from the beginning of this chapter leads me to believe that they'll be having some conflict with each other in the future. Casca, I think, will be forever thankful for Farnese and everything she did for Elaine. Subconsciously, this is displayed in this chapter when she instinctively grabs Farnese for comfort after being sedated. It's also a neat detail that Casca looks like Elaine while she's passed out and helpless. But Farnese's response to this in this chapter is interesting. She has one of Berserk's signature vague internal monologues that the audience will have to interpret for themselves. Think back to Griffith's internal monologue right before the eclipse as Guts runs to him. What does it all mean? That's for the audience to think about. The general read of this gesture seems to be that Farnese doesn't feel worthy of this warmth from Casca, as a major characterizing aspect of Farnese since joining the group has been between her feelings of worthlessness, but I have a different potential reading of this situation. All Farnese says here is, "I'm not," which I think is representative of Farnese's reservations about being Casca's emergency blanket. Farnese hasn't always been the best to Casca. On our boat voyages, she did get verbally frustrated with Casca in her Elaine state for not loving Guts as much as Farnese thought she should for everything he had done for her. But ultimately these outbursts only come from Farnese's jealousy and love for Guts. I think this will be the main conflict between Farnese and Casca, and it's been building for a while. Farnese is in love with Guts, and unlike Shurike, who's in love with Guts in a "I'm only just discovering my sexuality and eventually Isidro will take the attention of my affection away" phase, but in a "I adore and owe everything to this man" way, in a Casca Griffith way. Berserk is a series of perpetual love triangles. This is a theme all throughout Berserk. There's the obvious massive one with Griffith, Guts, and Casca, but there's also Griffith, Charlotte, and Casca, Judo, Casca, and Guts, Shurike, Isma, and Isidro, but most notably for this discussion there's two, with Farnese, Roderick, and Guts, where Farnese is the Casca, Guts is the Griffith, and Roderick is the Guts, and the Casca, Guts, and Farnese one that really doesn't need explaining. And the more you think about these complicated character triangles, the better all the characters involved become, as well as the series overall. Guts, barring the first page of the entire manga, doesn't give a fuck about a single woman that isn't Casca. In the hottest moment in manga history, crazy Farnese, the hottest Farnese, throws herself at him as directly as possible, and there's not even an implication that Guts gives a fuck or is turned on. He's got a one-track, loyal sexual mind for Casca and Casca only, making Farnese's love for him unrequited in every sense of the word. Farnese has the same unrequited love for Guts that Casca did with Griffith, but I believe to close the parallel triangle here, a jealous Farnese overlooking a happily together Guts and Casca will find solace in the second option, as Casca did with Guts in Roderick, barring some unlikely massive heel turn from Roderick that I'm still somewhat fearful of. That's how I see the situation being resolved, but the conflict and jealousy must come first, and I look forward to seeing it manifest in the narrative, and look forward to Casca and Farnese coming out the other side of this would-be conflict closer than ever, as equals, as maybe sisters, rather than patient and caretaker. Overall, this chapter had some Casca in it, and the Casca content is heading in a direction wholly satisfying to me. I'm still thrilled she's back conscious at all, and I'm thankful for every moment, so that's a massive thumbs up for this chapter. I just wrote 1,500 words over the implications of the first 3 pages of this chapter, so let's hurry up and move on. The second scene of the chapter and the bulk of the chapter is some power scaling antics with Shurike and Farnese on their first day in class. Now, I'm not going to go over everything here, but basically the scene boils down to Miura trying to establish the power of all the little mages on Elfhelm to make it evident to the audience the island's overall fighting strength, likely in anticipation for the large-scale attack we seem to all agree will eventually happen on Elfhelm, and to establish that Shurike will be the black mage moving forward and Farnese will be the white mage, which is a fantastic characterizing tool to differentiate the two of them, which I somehow didn't see coming. For those of you unfamiliar with these terms, Shurike will blow shit up and Farnese will heal the party moving forward. This is a big brain move on Miura's part, as it seemed a little redundant when Farnese wanted to become a mage originally, as it seemed she was just going to be in combat situations made completely redundant compared to Shurike, and wouldn't really have her own purpose for being a magician in the narrative. But now Shurike will attack and Farnese will heal, which gives them both purpose in combat, while having them both still be magic users. This is also thematically brilliant, as not only has Farnese's character development come so far that she is now a witch, when she used to be a witch hunter that couldn't even see Puck due to her closed-mindedness, but also that the once witch hunter who executed and destroyed thousands of lives will atone for that by saving hopefully thousands of lives moving forward, through learning healing magic. The witch hunter turned witch and the killer turned healer. That's some quality character writing right there, and almost corroborates my bold claim that Farnese is the most developed and focused on character in the entire series. Also, I do really like the redesign and the new outfit, since I was never really that big of a fan of short hair Farnese. So everything with Farnese here is a big positive for me. Morda, which is the name of the witch with black hair overlooking everything, is also an element of the chapter that has interesting implications, as I feel she will be becoming a more involved character in the narrative moving forward. She's immediately stood out since she was first introduced, not only for a distinctively devilish personality, but also because of her character design, which is that of someone who's not just going to play in the background for the rest of the series. There was a point in initially reading this chapter that I thought she was being teased as a possible magical rival for Farnese, but there seems to already be quite a bit of setup for Farnese's forward direction in the narrative, so I think she'll either, as I've been saying for a long time, betray everyone and help Griffith in his attack on the island somehow, or she'll be Shurike's rival moving forward. Or maybe both. It can be inferred that Morta is a lot stronger magically than the other would-be mages on the island due to the fact that she isn't blown away like the rest of them by what Farnese and Shurikei demonstrated in the chapter. Also, Morta has potential to be a good foil for Shurikei, as she is many things Shurikei isn't, but probably wants to be, which could lead to some jealousy. Morta looks more like a woman than Shurikei and is older than Shurikei. She's prettier basically, which is something Shurikei would naturally be jealous of, especially if Morta is antagonistic towards Shurikei by teasing her or being better than her at magic or something. I could see Isidro easily playing into this, as Morta might flirt with him to make fun of Shurikei, which would also develop their relationship a little further as well. And then if this leads to Morta joining Griffith or being tempted by Griffith in some way, then Shurikei would have a potential magical rival to fight come the grand final battle at the end of the series, since Sonya, who may have played that role, doesn't seem to be much of a fighter. We've seen the coming-of-age story from the male's perspective in Berserk through Guts already, and likely we will see it again through Isidro in the future, but a female coming-of-age story through Shurikei could be very interesting. Farnese has a lot of places to go in the immediate future of the narrative, but this could be Shurikei's direction moving forward. Also, it looks like Shurikei is going to be learning some high-level magic that might lead to another reunion with Flora in the future, and it would be an interesting way to introduce this dynamic with Morta if she was also learning this technique at the same time or was even just Shurikei's training partner. But an aspect I love here was the subtle backstory Miura gives here with the old mage and Flora. When expositing about the more powerful magical ability to Shurikei, the old mage mentions that Flora was his old friend. We don't ever need to know more, we don't ever need a flashback, it fits and we understand the connection here intrinsically. The subtlety is important and Miura understands where to use it effectively. Also, before moving on, we should mention Serpico's running gag from the chapter, where he is still both protective of Farnese and shocked at her magical prowess. It gave him something to do this chapter, I guess, even if it was a little weird. So now let's move on to the third and final scene from this chapter, Guts training on the cliffside and being approached by Skull Knight. This is a parallel to the scene after Guts originally fought Zod for the first time, where he practiced alone near the stairs in the royal palace in Windham. Guts was in a similar mindset in both of these instances, as he feels powerless in the face of something monumental. Originally it was Zod's unbelievable strength, and now it's his powerlessness to help Casca now that she's gotten her mind back. And after that moment on the stairs in Windham, Guts shortly finds a new path after having a conversation with Griffith that might be paralleled contemporarily by Skull Knight, who many have speculated might be taking Guts away for a little while on a new mission. Not really much else happens in this scene, as it seems to be teasing possible events in the next chapter, which is funnily enough what the last chapter did as well, with the last page being a tease of Skull Knight appearing on Elfhelm. Skull Knight does however indicate that his prophecy about her wish not being his wish may have been fulfilled, which is great news for Guts. Because if this was what Skull Knight was talking about originally on the beach, then we have no indication of what's going to happen in the future, which means it's more likely that we'll get a happy Guts and Casca ending, since now Skull Knight's prophecy has been fulfilled. But we know what's upcoming for Casca as a character, healing from the trauma and potential conflict with Farnese, but what is next for Guts' character? He seems to have nothing besides eventually having a proper reunion with Casca and a final showdown with Griffith in his future. And I think that's what Skull Knight's purpose in the narrative is for appearing here. So is the obvious happening? Is Skull Knight taking Guts on some sort of lucrative mission that he's got lined up on the mainland? Is Miura going to use this opportunity to finally give us the Skull Knight / Geyserich backstory we've been waiting for 20 years? Maybe it's time to use the Dragon Slayer to slay a literal dragon. I'm not sure, and frankly my interest in any of these but the Skull Knight backstory is dwarfed by all the other pre-existing plotlines and blooming plotlines on Elfhelm with the other characters. Guts is maybe the least interesting character right now, and I think maybe the narrative could use from taking a break from Guts to focus on some other characters. But maybe not. Whatever Miura decides to do after this chapter, whether it be focusing on some other characters for a little while, or staying with Guts, I'm sure it'll be brilliant. I really love the structure of this chapter, and really the last 3 chapters of Berserk have all been really good. We're in a transitionary period as we ready up for the 3rd act of Berserk. The inciting incident is coming to rekindle the flame of war between Griffith and Guts, and I can't wait to see how we get there. I just supremely hope that it isn't Casca getting captured by Griffith. I'd much prefer Guts to be the damsel for once. And that's really all I have to say about the chapter. Miura's end note about his life not changing at all because of the coronavirus may be the most relatable thing ever, and the art is undeniably the best it's ever been. That's all I have to say. Berserk chapter 360 was great, every chapter is a blessing, it sucks that we aren't getting anything next month, but what are we going to do about it? Support links in the description below. Thanks.